You've probably heard claims like these before. Some say Jesus never existed, that he's just a myth. Others argue that he's only mentioned in the Bible, a book written by humans to establish a new kingdom, gain power and wealth. But is that really true? Let's examine the historical evidence beyond the Bible and uncover the truth. Let's get into it. When it comes to non-Christian historical sources, Tacitus is one of the most important. He was a Roman senator, governor, and historian, known for his detailed and reliable writings. In his work, Annals, written around 116 AD, Tacitus describes the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD and how Emperor Nero blamed the Christians to deflect suspicion from himself. He specifically mentions Christus, Latin for Christ, who was executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. Now here's the interesting part. Tacitus had no sympathy for Christians. He called Christianity a pernicious superstition and described it as a dangerous movement. But despite his clear bias against the faith, he confirmed Jesus' existence as a historical figure, his crucifixion under Pilate, and the spread of Christianity across the Roman Empire. If Jesus were just a myth, why would a Roman historian who despised Christianity write about him as a real person? That's strong evidence that Jesus wasn't just a legend, but a man who truly lived and changed history. Another crucial historical source is Flavius Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian who wrote extensively about Jewish history and Roman rule. He wasn't a Christian, yet he made two references to Jesus in his famous work, Antiquities of the Jews, written around 93-94 AD. The first and most famous passage, called the Testimonium Flavianum, describes Jesus as a wise teacher who performed surprising works, gathered followers, was condemned by Pilate, and was crucified. Some scholars believe later Christian scribes may have altered parts of this text, but even non-Christian historians agree. Josephus originally wrote something about Jesus that confirms his existence. The second mention is even more straightforward. Josephus refers to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, and describes how he was sentenced to death. This brief but direct statement is a crucial piece of evidence. After all, how could Jesus have a brother if he never existed? Josephus, a Jewish historian with no reason to promote Christianity, gives us one of the earliest non-Christian confirmations of Jesus' life. You may not have heard of Mara bar Serapion, but his testimony is fascinating. He was a Stoic philosopher from Syria, and he wrote a letter to his son while imprisoned, offering wisdom about life, suffering, and injustice. In this letter, dated sometime after 70 AD, he compares Jesus to Socrates and Pythagoras, two historical figures famous for their wisdom and unjust deaths. Mara doesn't refer to Jesus by name, but he speaks of a wise king whom the Jews killed only for his teachings to live on. He argues that those who killed these wise men suffered the consequences. Athens was devastated after executing Socrates, Samos declined after killing Pythagoras, and Jerusalem was destroyed after killing Jesus. Now think about this. Mara was not a Christian, yet he recognized Jesus as a real person and a great teacher. He didn't talk about miracles or divine claims. He simply acknowledged Jesus as a historical figure whose influence continued long after his death. That's yet another independent, non-Christian confirmation of his existence. Now let's talk about Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor of Bithynia, modern-day Turkey, who wrote letters to Emperor Trajan around 112 AD. Why is he important? Because in one letter he describes how Christians worship Jesus as a god and refuse to deny him, even when faced with execution. Pliny wasn't writing a history book. He was asking Trajan for advice on how to deal with Christians. He explains that they gathered before dawn, sang hymns to Christ as to a god, took oaths to be morally upright, and refused to worship Roman gods. He also mentions that many of them were willing to die rather than abandon their faith. Now here's the key takeaway. Pliny confirms that just a few decades after Jesus' death, he was already being worshipped as divine by people across the Roman Empire. If Jesus were a myth, how did his followers spread so quickly, and why were they willing to suffer and die for him? Pliny's letter is powerful evidence of both Jesus' existence and the deep devotion of his earliest followers. Celsus was a Greek philosopher from the 2nd century, and he was one of the earliest critics of Christianity. Around 175 AD, he wrote a book called The True Word, in which he tried to discredit Jesus and his followers. Celsus argued that Jesus was not divine and that his miracles were nothing more than tricks. He even tried to spread rumors that Jesus was the son of a Roman soldier named Panthera. But here's the key point. While attacking Jesus, Celsus never denied that he existed. In fact, his arguments only make sense if Jesus was a real person. If Jesus were just a myth, why would Celsus go through so much effort to refute him? Myths don't need to be disproven, but real historical figures do. The fact that Celsus acknowledges Jesus, even while trying to discredit him, is yet another piece of evidence for his existence. But what about Jewish sources? Did Jesus' own people acknowledge him? Let's look at what the Jewish Talmud has to say. The Talmud is a collection of Jewish writings that document rabbinic discussions on law, ethics, and history. Although most of it was compiled between the 3rd and 6th centuries, some passages contain traditions that go back to the 1st and 2nd centuries. And yes, the Talmud does mention Jesus. In these writings, Jesus, referred to as Yeshu, is accused of leading Israel astray and practicing sorcery. One passage states that he was executed on the eve of Passover, which matches the gospel accounts of his crucifixion. Another says that he performed miracles through magic, confirming that even his enemies acknowledged his supernatural works. Now think about this. If Jesus never existed, why would the Jewish authorities, who had every reason to deny him, write about him at all? The fact that the Talmud records Jesus, even in a hostile way, further proves that he was a real historical figure. So what have we learned? From Roman historians like Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, to Jewish writers like Josephus and the Talmud, and even critics like Celsus and Serapion, multiple sources outside the Bible confirm that Jesus was a real person. These accounts prove that Jesus lived, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, had a following, and was remembered, even by those who didn't believe in him. If Jesus were just a myth, why would so many different sources, some hostile, some neutral, acknowledge his existence? The evidence speaks for itself. Jesus wasn't just a legend, he was real, and his impact changed history forever. What do you think? Do you still question Jesus' existence? Let me know in the comments, and let's uncover more evidence together. If you found this interesting, consider liking and subscribing. There's always more to explore.